Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I have a very special episode for you today, which I call The Little People, the high strangeness ET contact story of Kelli Anderson. That is a pseudonym. She did not want her real name used, but she did a write-up for me of all of her amazing experiences. I also interviewed her firsthand, and wow, her story is so amazing because it involves a very wide variety of not only ET events, but the paranormal, including, but not limited to, UFOs, missing time, ETs, ghosts, psychic events, precognition, a tree spirit, owl stories, orbs, OBEs, an apparent miracle, and more. So really a series of really unusual events, and some startlingly unique. I did write up her experience in my book, Humanoids and High Strangeness. In that book, I really tried to embrace all the events that surround ET contact. ET contact usually comes along with a wide variety of paranormal events of all kinds, and that's certainly true with Kelli Anderson. Her story is particularly profound, super interesting, really unique in a lot of ways, and I think you'll find it really compelling and interesting. So, let's just get started. She didn't want to admit it, but recent events had convinced Kelli that she was a complete freak. It was 1968, she was only 8 years old, just starting out, but so many strange things were happening to her that had no rational explanation, she didn't know what else to think. At the time, she and her older sister, I'll call her Julie, that is a pseudonym, who was 1 year older, had recently gotten their own rooms. Her father was a music teacher, and he had moved his music room into the garage so that the girls could each have their own space. At the time, they were living in a 3-bedroom house in Escondido, California. Now, they weren't a religious family, but Kelli did have a friend who was, and Kelli began to develop an interest in the concept of God. So when her friend received a new Bible in Sunday school, Kelli asked her if she could have her old one, and her friend agreed. And as Kelli says, I often read it by flashlight in bed at night. Jesus' words were all in red print, and I read and reread those red words with fascination. And after such a night of reading, something happened that, after decades of wondering about, I now believe shaped the rest of my life. It was late at night, and Kelli was getting very sleepy, so she decided to stop reading and just go to sleep. As she says, I just snapped off the flashlight and was adjusting my eyes to the darkness when there came a sudden low rumble and the sound of the glass at my window trembling. My immediate thought was that a burglar was trying to force the window open. I shut my eyes tight in fear, thinking that my survival depended on faking that I was asleep and knew nothing. My heart pounded with dread at the sound of heavy, slow footsteps coming to the side of my bed. I figured I was done for, as the edge of my bed sagged with the heaviness of someone sitting beside me. Heart-racing panic ensued as I clung to the idea that he might let me live if he thought I was asleep, so I kept my eyes glued shut. I knew that they were leaning down right next to my face. Then there was a clicking sound, and light flooded through my closed eyelids, showing red. Now I knew he wasn't being sneaky and had no fear of me at all. The light seemed to peer through my closed eyes for an eternity as I struggled not to move and give myself away. So Kelli wanted to scrunch her eyes more tightly closed, but she was smart enough to know that such an action would look phony, and it was at this point she felt a terrible itch on her arm, but was even too afraid to scratch that, lest her movement betray the fact that she was faking being asleep. Then, to her great relief, the pressure on the mattress disappeared, there was another loud clicking sound, and the eerie red light went out. She didn't hear any footsteps moving away, so she still feared that her mysterious intruder was lurking in the room, and perhaps testing her, so she continued feigning sleep. She lay there in unmoving terror for most of the rest of the night, too afraid to open her eyes, and not until she sensed the morning light coming in through the windows, heard the birds start to sing, did she take action. Not even daring to inspect her room, she sprung from her bed, ran for her life, and landed in a frenzied heap on her parents' bed, waking them both up from a sound sleep. And breathless, she ranted and raved about the intruder who had haunted her all night long. Now her mother listened with concern and then said, "You are just dreaming. It was a nightmare." Kelli protested. She knew this wasn't a nightmare. She was awake, but her mother just shook her head unconvinced. As Kelli says, "I knew it wasn't a dream. And if it wasn't a burglar, I decided it must have been some sort of monster. I've periodically thought of possibilities over the years and still have no definite conclusions. If only I had had the nerve to open my eyes, I think. It would take me nearly 40 more years of living and inexplicable experiences before I would begin to see a pattern in the strange events." How interesting is that? As we know, ET contact usually does start at a very early age. And I suspect that this was ET contact. Certainly Kelli has considered it, but again, it's a little bit ambiguous. Could have been a ghostly visitation. Hard to say for sure, but certainly super interesting. And it was following this that her life really began to change. She blossomed into a whole series of psychic events that really changed the way she thought about the world. So yeah, the next chapter is all about psychic events. So it wasn't long after this strange childhood bedroom encounter that Kelli had a very odd dream. And at the time she didn't think there was much to it. As she says, "One morning I woke up with the image of my own hand on a piece of glass that was spidering out in cracked patterns beneath it. That was all, just a snapshot image, but the dream had a certain nagging insistence about it that in time I would learn to recognize." Later that day, she and her family went to visit relatives in the town of Julian. Kelli and her cousins were playing around in their uncle's feed and supply store, and while crawling among the bales of alfalfa and sacks of feed, Kelli heard and felt something crack below her hand. And as she says, "I looked down and saw the exact image of my dream upon waking that morning. The weirdness of it made me scream unintentionally, but it hadn't hurt. I'd just ruined our fun game and got us all in trouble. When asked why I screamed, I just said, 'I don't know.'" So after a few more incidents like this, where Kelli had inexplicable foreknowledge of events, she began to question her sanity and wonder what the heck was going on with her. So unable to understand, she went to her mother and told her what was happening. As Kelli says, "My mother assured me that it was nothing to fear. She herself had occasional premonitions and unusual experiences, and her grandmother had clairvoyant dreams. My great-grandmother had even seen an angel once, and reportedly had healing abilities. So I was somewhat relieved to discover I wasn't a complete freak." This is, of course, when Kelli's interests and focus in life began to shift more towards spirituality. She began to collect little Buddha statues and figurines of various deities. She pilfered candles from her grandmother's drawer and set up a secret little temple in her closet. And as she says, "I just sit in there and look at them and wonder about God. I called this sanctuary my Buddha hut." As you might imagine, experiencing all this paranormal and precognition and psychic events changed the way she thought about life at a very young age, made her a very deeply spiritual person. And events were still in progress because she was now about to experience something, a huge event that would change everything, change the course of her life, really affected her whole family as well. So from a very young age, again, Kelli was deeply spiritual. She began to feel a very strong connection to nature, particularly to trees, and when her parents gave her a toy doctor's kit, she didn't use it on people, but instead used it on trees. As she says, "I made up poultices for injured trees on our property out of various leaves, herbs, and flour, and lovingly applied it. Trees were not background objects to me, but more like close friends. I climbed up in them and sat for long periods of time, singing made-up songs or just thinking. I drew pictures of trees and wrote poems about them. But my childhood would come to a screeching halt by the time I was 11. So at this time, at age 11, Kelli began to have this very weird repetitive dream. It happened every night and it was always the same. And in this dream, Kelli found herself running for her life from a huge crowd of children chasing her across the field. It was a very vivid dream, and different from most of her dreams. And after 3 nights of having this same dream over and over, Kelli woke up one school morning and told her mom about it. And her mom asked, of course, how are things going at school? Handing Kelli the sack lunch she had prepared for her. And Kelli said, fine, same as it always is. She thought it was an odd question for her mom to ask because she didn't think the dream had anything to do with school. In fact, Kelli's school life was very happy. She was popular enough, she had good friends, the schoolwork was easy for her, she got very good grades. She was having a good time at school. And her mother said, well then don't worry about it. So Kelli didn't. She dismissed the dream and walked off towards school. On the way there, she met up with one of her friends, and as they walked along the trail going to school, they saw a group of other schoolgirls heading in the same direction ahead of them. And this is when things became strange because out of the blue, Kelli's friend, for some weird reason, randomly picked up a rock and tossed it ahead of her. Accidentally, to the horror of them both, the rock struck one of the girls ahead of them right on the back. And of all people, the girl hit by this rock was the school bully, the meanest girl in the 8th grade. So Kelli's friend immediately hid behind her and pleaded, please Kelli, don't tell her it was me. And as Kelli says, I didn't have time to think because the bully and her minions were already upon us. She glared into my eyes with hatred and jabbed my chest with her finger as I stood my sorry ground and aimed for no expression. You're going to wish you were never born, the bully hissed as her cohorts giggled nervously. The sound of the school bell could be heard just then, and thankfully the crowd broke for the grounds in a hurry. So Kelli thought to herself, that was close. Her friend thanked her profusely and they rushed to class. Now throughout the day, Kelli kept a careful lookout for the bully, but thankfully she did not run into her. And when the school day ended, Kelli decided that to be safe, just in case the bully was waiting for her, she would stay late at school and help the teacher, which she did, putting away books, cleaning the blackboard, and doing other small jobs. And as Kelli says, as I later banged 2 erasers together outside the classroom door, I felt the sense of doom as I watched the white puffs of chalk fall heavy to the grass. A quick scan of the empty halls and grounds assured me that only my teacher and myself remained. At some point the teacher said my mother would probably be getting worried if I didn't get home soon. I'd bought quite a bit of time with all my cleaning, and I figured no kid was going to hang around in an empty school any longer than they had to. The buses were long gone, the bike racks were empty, and the school was clearly deserted. So Kelli turned to the teacher and said, okay then, I'll see you tomorrow. She glanced out the window to double check that the coast was clear, and it was. But it was not to be. Kelli would never see her teacher again. Only slightly concerned and seeing no sign of the bully, Kelli headed home. And as she says, I gripped my books tightly as my brisk footsteps echoed down the empty halls and towards the gate. I'd soon be home, and tomorrow the incident would be, if not forgotten, at least diminished. Tomorrow I'd make a new plan. I made it past the bike rack and was coming to a stand of trees when, in a blurry rush of dawning and adrenaline, I saw them rushing towards me. It was a whole pack of frenzied kids with their main dog, the school bully, in the lead. It was totally unexpected and bizarre. I reacted instinctively and just kept running towards home, looking back when I dared to see if I had lost them. So she ran as fast as she could, but they kept running after her, and the next thing she knows, she ran out of breath and, looking up, saw that she was surrounded by a large circle of kids. Some of them were supposedly her friends, but not anymore. And the bully came in towards her like a prize fighter, she said, with a hateful look of glee spreading across her face, and said, "You're done for." So Kelli tried to defend herself, but she was not able to. She felt time actually seeming to slow down as she got beat up by this school bully. The next thing she knew, she was lying on the ground and getting pounded by this school bully. She lost consciousness, actually. When she woke up, she was on the couch in her friend's house and later learned that her older sister had come running to investigate and rescued Kelli. Uh, so Kelli thanks her sister for basically saving her life. But this was exactly like the dream had predicted. Kelli was left deeply traumatized by this event. The kids that she thought were her friends had done nothing to stop the attack, and Kelli herself had done nothing to deserve it. She hadn't even thrown the rock that precipitated all of this. When Kelli shared that event with me, my heart went out to her. I mean, that must have been really hard for her. She said that it was. Very sad, very poignant. But it ended up having a really interesting silver lining. As many difficult events do, they can lead to a great awakening. And that's certainly what happened to her. And this next event that she describes is so interesting, so unique. I don't think I've ever heard anything quite like this. This is a level of contact that is really unusual and interesting and profound. So as you might expect, this event affected her profoundly. Not only her, her entire family. They ended up pulling Kelli out of school and her sister, and shortly later moved to this beautiful little town called Julian, located in Southern California. It's very rural, surrounded by trees and mountains. It's a beautiful area. But Kelli, as a result of this really traumatic experience, became quite isolated. She had no desire to make any new friends. But the good news was she loved this new town of Julian. It was surrounded by trees, and trees had always been her best friends anyway. And by luck, the school year was now over, and she had all summer to enjoy the forest around her house. So once again, she rejoiced among the trees. Nowhere else but in the forest had she found such peace, and her house was right in the middle of it. As Kelli says, our house was a gray wooden split level, set on a sloping hill of clay. The pines and oak trees that surrounded the house on all sides were thick and towering, extending into the web of forest that covered the local hills. The scents and sounds of the trees were ever present, whether buckling with heavy drifts of snow or being worked by squirrels, woodpeckers, and jays. At night, the wind whistled high over the rub and creak of limbs, and the house so closely meshed. So this was a welcome change from the trauma Kelli had left behind in Escondido, and it was that summer that she had her first of a series of very lucid dreams about a mysterious entity she would later name Birch. These dreams were very vivid, very realistic, and they came nightly, without fail, and were very comforting. As Kelli says, they always began and ended exactly the same way. I would be walking in the forest, admiring the trees, and everything would become extremely vivid. Colors and textures stood out along with the natural sounds and smells of the forest. I could even feel the breeze on my skin. I would stop to gaze upon a particular tree, when suddenly a loud rustling of leaves would cause me to turn and look in the direction of the rising wind. As soon as I turned my head back around, a man appeared where only a tree had stood before. I say man because I have no other way of explaining him. The truth is, I knew I loved him from the first, and felt as if I'd always known him. But after waking, I could never remember what he looked like. I dreamed of him every night for a year, and yet upon waking, his form had already vanished from my memory. So these sound very much like out-of-body experiences, but certainly very lucid dreams at the very least. And while the dreams began and ended the same way, there was always some variation in the middle of them. As Kelli says, we somehow traveled through the forest, having deep and inspiring conversations. The overriding feelings I had were of love. Love is too small a word for what I felt. I would come to him with grievances about the world in general, and my little world in particular, and somehow he would bring me to a place of profound compassion towards it all. At the point of my understanding, I would hear or feel the gust again and turn my head in that direction. When I looked back for him, he was gone, but a tree was where he'd been. So one day, Kelli summoned the courage to actually ask his name. And this man, this spirit, replied, birch. This was odd, Kelli thought, because the forest around them was mostly oak and pines. Birch called the other trees, quote, his friends. Kelli fully understood that because she felt the same way. And these strange dreams, or OBEs, affected Kelli profoundly. They were so vivid, so beautiful, that upon awakening, she felt as if she had truly been out in the forest, and she always woke with a deep sense of peace and happiness. And it was strange, because she had no other dreams, and each night she would go to bed with incredible excitement, knowing that she'd get to meet Birch again, talk with him, and wander through the forest. She came to rely upon him deeply for companionship. But at the same time, it was kind of frustrating because she could never remember what he looked like. And the conversations she had with him, while long and varied, were always somewhat shrouded in forgetfulness. And upon awakening, they'd flee from her awareness like a flock of scared birds. She even kept a pad of paper and a pen next to her bed in the hopes of capturing something, anything. But alas, it never happened. So she still had no idea what he looked like, though in her heart she pictured him as a shining and beautiful man. But it was okay, because Kelli knew that she would see him the next night and the night after that. She had finally found a true friend, and she no longer felt the sadness and confusion and trauma that had overwhelmed her following this terrible beating that she had endured. And she found herself enjoying her sleep life as much as her waking night. Then, one night she went to sleep, and as she knew he would, Birch appeared in front of her. And as usual, they ambled through the forest, talking of everything under the sun. After what seemed like hours, Birch turned to her and said something that made her stomach drop. He said, "We will no longer be meeting like this." Kelli immediately woke up, the words still echoing in her mind. She thought to herself, this can't be true. Birch would never leave her. But he did. Despite all her efforts and repeated entreaties for him to come back, these dreams came to a sudden end. She longed terribly for him to return, but that was it. Following this, her nights became ordinary again, and she never saw him. It was a tragic loss. She felt a hollow emptiness that his absence had left in her life. She missed him more than she could express. She hadn't realized how much she had come to depend on his friendship. But as the days and weeks passed into months and years, she was able to look back on that special summer with an incredible sense of gratitude and love. Her meetings with Birch had left her forever changed, and although she couldn't remember specifically their long conversations, she knew that he was the wisest, most loving creature that she would ever have the grace or honor to know. She looked upon him as some kind of tree spirit, one who had come to her because she had a special relationship with trees and worked hard to heal them. And when she needed a healing, Birch was there for her. She speculates that he only left her because her healing was complete. But for years afterward, and still, she missed him. How amazing is that? I mean, I think we've all heard of things like nature spirits, but to have someone describe an event so clearly in such depth, to have someone experience something that changed her so profoundly, I mean, that's just amazing. I've never heard anyone describe an event like that before. I suspect other people have had these kinds of experiences, but so amazing. And again, shows how high strangeness, paranormal events are often a part of the whole contactee experience. And as life moved along for Kelli, sure enough, more events occurred, including not only paranormal events, but apparent visitations by ETs or maybe ghosts. Again, there's a little bit of ambiguity here. With the Birch dreams over, Kelli's attention was now drawn to the many weird events occurring in their house. For example, there was this heavy wood door at the bottom of the stairs that kept opening by itself. Nobody ever actually saw it opening, but they certainly remembered closing it, yet it would be opened in the morning. And of course, that wasn't all. Shortly after moving into this house, they found this deep red stain on the concrete floor of their room, and they could not get rid of it. So they just ended up painting the floor red and basically getting curtains and other furniture to match. But not long after moving in, Kelli started to see something she couldn't understand. Visitations of some kind of weird figures. As she says, many a late moonlit night I awoke to the surreal vision of several tall, thin, nearly human-looking figures moving back and forth in front of the windows. Their shapes were easily discernible through the sheer curtains, but I was always too afraid to get up and pull the curtains back. They were too tall and thin to be quite human, and besides, the windows were several feet off the ground, so I knew they had to be floating instead of walking. So although they didn't seem to be human, the idea of extraterrestrials had not entered Kelli's mind at this point, and she wondered if they might be ghosts. In fact, her curiosity was even more sparked when she found what looked like child's carvings of ghost-like figures, similar-looking figures, etched into a wooden plank above the closet door. Then, one night, she had a very close encounter with whoever these people were. As Kelli says, my sister was away, and I was alone in our room reading. The upstairs door was closed, and my parents were in the living room watching television. I just turned out the light and lay face down with one leg dangling from under the covers off the edge of the mattress. As soon as I closed my eyes, I felt someone push my leg back onto the top of the bed before arranging the blanket over my legs. It took a few moments for my brain to catch up to the fact that I was alone in my room. I shot off the bed and took the stairs by twos, racing up to the top like a maniac. I shoved the door open with a rude jolt and stared at my parents, who were sitting on the couch laughing at their favorite sitcom, The Honeymooners. So she asked them, was someone just downstairs? And of course, no, there wasn't. So that was very strange. It quite frightened her, even though ultimately it was a very benevolent event. And soon more events would occur that convinced everyone in the house that there was something there. They would experience unexplained cold drafts of air. On occasion, an object would slide across the table, fly across the room, fall off a shelf. It was startling, of course, but somehow not scary, and it came to convince Kelli that there were such things as spirits. So she came to look upon them as unseen friends. And another strange thing were owls. They would appear all the time around the house, more than you would think. Now, once, as Kelli's mother sat in her art room, an owl would come sit at the window and stare at her, even during the day, and Kelli's mother admitted that they gave her an uneasy feeling. So this became another weird thing that was going on in Kelli's life. So interesting. In my personal opinion, because Kelli's describing these silhouettes, these figures she saw as being somewhat not human looking, very, very slender. I suspect they were ETs, but she leaves the interpretation open because until you're sure, you don't know. But so interesting. Also interesting is how owls started to become a part of all of this, which certainly, as you may know, does seem to be a part of the ET experience. Owls come up again and again, and they would come up in the future in a really dramatic way. But now events took a turn where it became pretty clear to Kelli that she was in fact a contactee, because UFOs showed up big time. So Kelli was 12 years old when the day came that she saw a UFO. She and her sister had landed their first babysitting job. They were caring for 2 toddlers and a baby. It was a long, hectic day. Neither of them had realized how difficult it was to care for children, but finally they had the children fed and put to bed, and Kelli's sister went into the kitchen and came out with a can of beer. Kelli was a little bit alarmed, but her sister said it's just one can. They'll never know. So, as Kelli says, she drank half of the beer and she gave me the other half. I snuck out into the back lot, and I was going to sit there and drink my beer under this tree. I sat down and leaned against this tree, and for some reason, maybe it was because I was tipping the beer, something made me look up. And right above the tree was this weird thing. I remember it looking like a long, gray, blimp-type thing, but it was so close to the top of the tree that it just freaked me out. I was all guilty, because I was sitting there drinking beer. I was like, oh my God, I've been busted. And that's the end of the memory. I don't remember running and screaming. I just remember being really, really paranoid. That's the end of the whole thing. I cannot remember. Years later, when Kelli asked her sister about it, her sister had no memory of this whatsoever. Didn't remember the babysitting job, didn't remember the UFO. It was so strange because Kelli didn't remember telling anyone either. And in fact, for years, the whole experience seemed to slip from her mind. And one day, she just spontaneously remembered it. Very amazing. When someone sees a UFO that close up, it almost always denotes deeper levels of contact. I think that's absolutely true in Kelli's case, especially given the fact that there was apparently some amnesia surrounding this event, neither of them fully remembering what happened until years later. It's a huge red flag. UFO researchers are certainly aware of this. This often does mean that there might have been missing time and perhaps an onboard experience. Kelli doesn't remember anything like that. She didn't have any dreams of being on board or anything like that. But she certainly wonders about it, and so do I. Now, moving along, this next event she described is stupendous. Really unique and unusual. I've never heard anything quite like it. And Kelli is absolutely sure that this was what we would call a miracle. So time marched on, and then one day, after receiving a blank diary as a gift, Kelli found she had a real talent for writing. She began to compose poems and songs, which her sister put to music. They actually formed a band and got gigs at school and local banquets and dance halls. Kelli also developed an interest in horseback riding. One of their neighbors had horses, and both Kelli and her sister began to take turns riding this horse. And they both enjoyed it so much that their father finally bought an old horse named Joker so they could ride whenever they wanted. But of course this brought new challenges, because living up in the mountains, the winters were pretty cold and snowy. And with her mother working as an artist and her father as a musician, there wasn't a whole lot of money for new warm clothes. Now Kelli's friends also rode horses, but they all had nice white long underwear beneath their outer clothes to keep them warm. And Kelli became increasingly envious about this. And as Christmas approached, she repeatedly begged her mother for a new pair of long underwear. But despite several requests, when Christmas morning arrived, there was no long underwear. Kelli did get a book about horses and other small gifts, which she loved, but disappointment flooded her. The book was nice, but she really wanted this pair of long underwear. So very sad and upset and disappointed about this, she decided to take her horse Joker for a ride. And as Kelli later wrote in her journal, I went out and slid across the mud and patches of dirty ice and pushed the bit into Joker's mouth. I threw the reins over his shoulders and stood on a log and leaped onto his back. The air was crisp and piney in the saturated hills of melting snow. I ran Joker into a gallop until my body became one with his rhythmic motions, and no matter how fast he ran, I knew I wouldn't slide off his back. The light glistened off the trees in the morning light as his chipped hooves clomped across the rock and frozen clay. We ran up a nearby hill for no particular reason, and as I rounded a turn through some trees, I leaned down near to Joker's neck for better balance on his wet and bony back, and when I sat up straight and lifted my eyes, I saw a miracle shimmering before us. I refer to this as the long underwear miracle. There it was, hovering like an angelic vision before me, a white, long-sleeved, long underwear shirt dangling from an oak branch. It was just high enough that I could only reach it from Joker's back. With trembling hands, I plucked the snow-soaked, bark-flecked shirt from the tree. I squeezed the water from it and examined it for tears or holes. It was perfect, not worn out looking, but neither with that embarrassingly new look either. I quickly looked around, but there were no signs of people in this area, and no tracks. I held it close to my body and whispered, "Thank you." I didn't know who I was thanking, but I felt sure it was somehow intended for me. My mother was genuinely shocked by my discovery, and for years after we would joke about some hapless hiker who had lost his shirt in the woods in a storm. If this was some clever ploy of a sympathetic unknown person, it was brilliant. Who knew of my long underwear longing besides my mother, who hadn't really understood its depth? To this day, the whole event remains mysterious. At the time, others saw it as a coincidental and insignificant occurrence. like so many odd events that make up our lives. By the time I was 14, though, I already knew that my life, with all its strangeness and brilliance, was more than that. So Kelli never did learn where the long underwear came from, but deep in her heart she believes it may have been a gift from Birch. But how he did it, she has no idea. Meanwhile, Kelli's psychic awareness grew by leaps and bounds. Daily she would predict who would be on the phone, what song would come next on the radio, what someone near her was going to say. These usually involved trivial events, but it happened so often that Kelli's mother took notice and actually began to strengthen Kelli's abilities by testing her with ESP cards. And this was a lot of fun for Kelli, so she started testing herself by predicting various events. And she quickly learned to take her hunches seriously, especially after one particularly poignant example. So there you go, the underwear miracle. Very unusual, really quite poignant, and so interesting. And she wonders to this day, as does her family, who was responsible for gifting her that pair of underwear hanging there on a tree in the middle of the forest. I mean, it's just beyond bizarre. But it certainly fits in with all these weird experiences that Kelli was having. It's certainly interesting to say the least. And Kelli's strange events continued. She was, again, always having experiences with ghosts and precognition and all kinds of psychic events. But now she was about to have a spirit visitation that left no doubt in her mind that there was life after death. One morning after getting out of bed, I noticed how absolutely still the house felt. I knew before opening my eyes that it meant a deep snow had fallen the night before. Suddenly, an image of my great-grandfather, who was alive and well, came to me. I felt a sharp, painful feeling of loss for no apparent reason. As the phone rang, which it always did if the snow was deep, I already knew it wasn't about there being no school that day. I knew at the sound of the ringing it would be about my mother's grandfather. After a few moments, my mother came downstairs and told us grandfather had just died of a sudden heart attack while going to the kitchen for a glass of water. This was my first of many bouts of sensing before I'd been told that someone close to me had passed on. The fact that my great-grandfather had died was upsetting, because it was my first experience of death. But I also had to wonder what it meant to know this beforehand. It nudged me deeper into the mysteries of the underworld. At age 14, Kelli met a boy. I'll call him Jay, that's a pseudonym. He was a Native American boy who lived nearby at the Santa Isabel Indian Reservation with his family. And Kelli and Jay soon fell deeply in love, and Kelli began to spend a lot of time on the reservation with Jay and his family. And this changed many things for her life. What a gift that is, to be able to be visited by a deceased loved one who lets you know that there is life after death. It's very special, very poignant, very profound. She's very blessed to have had that experience. But now, falling in love at a very young age with a Native American boy, her life was now about to take another major turn. And in fact, as she spent more and more time on the reservation, she started to realize that the people that she was living with viewed the life in the universe in a very different way. And this really altered her thinking to some extent, and I think her experiences as well. Kelli soon learned that Jay's family and the people around him acknowledged paranormal events as absolutely true. They were something accepted as a part of life. People would report strange entities that would come into the room, causing temporary paralysis. There was all kinds of strange poltergeist-like activity, knockings on windows and doors, objects being tossed around. On one occasion, Kelli and a friend had just driven to the reservation and parked when something struck the car with such force the vehicle actually lifted up on two wheels and then slammed back down. After recovering, the two of them exited the vehicle and searched the area. There was no sign of anyone, no tracks. Kelli wondered what could be so strong as to lift the car like that. And it was around this time Kelli had a very powerful out-of-body experience. She had taken a long hike, went into the house to take a nap, All of a sudden, her body became enveloped by a powerful electric vibration feeling. She heard loud crackling sounds, and Kelli suddenly found herself soaring through the sky. She realized she was astral projecting, and pretty soon got pulled back into her body. Another thing Kelli quickly learned about the reservation is that owls were seen as messengers from the other world, and often harbingers of misfortune. None of the people on the reservation liked seeing them near their homes, or even hearing them, and if any owl lingered for too long, people would throw rocks at them. At the time, Kelli kind of viewed it as a quaint superstition, even though she and her family were having similar experiences, strange experiences with owls. And later, Kelli would have reason to re-evaluate her outlook on all of this. Kelli's boyfriend, Jay, did have an elderly uncle who she adored, and he would often regale her with fantastic tales of the supernatural, such as about a man named Toquish who went dancing and then turned into an eagle. There were all kinds of stories he had and would share them, and Kelli found them absolutely fascinating. But once he did something that really left her wondering. One evening, the family was sitting in front of the fireplace enjoying the heat of the flames when the sound of an owl brought dead silence among them, and at this point, Uncle jumped up, and walking like a bird, he approached the fireplace and grabbed a large red-hot coal and placed it on the palm of his hand. As Kelli says, he began singing an Indian song and paused only to blow on the coal, which then fired up even brighter. The coal was at least the size of a golf ball, and it was plain to see it was glowing all the way through. Uncle then popped the coal into his mouth and somehow continued singing like that for several minutes. Horrified, I quickly glanced over at Jay's father, who made a face that told me not to do anything. At the end of what seemed an excruciatingly long song, Uncle nonchalantly spit the coal into his hand and blew on it again. We could see it was still red hot. With no more concern than someone holding a rock, he slowly took it back to the fire and replaced it under the log. He wasn't harmed in the slightest way. So that was truly amazing and really made Kelli realize how extraordinary these people were that she was living with. How amazing is that? It's clear that Uncle has a very advanced understanding of some things. I mean, being able to handle a hot coal like that, all his amazing stories. Some really interesting events occurred during her time on the reservation. But now, as often happens with people who are contactees, events were to escalate. And Kelli soon had an experience that made her realize in unequivocal terms that she was in fact a contactee because she was visited directly by extraterrestrials. Shortly after Kelli turned 16 years old, her boyfriend Jay joined the army. And to avoid being separated, the two of them decided to get married. Before they left, Uncle approached Kelli and told her that by the time she returned, he would be gone. This was a chilling prophecy that turned out to be true. So Kelli followed Jay to Germany, where he was transferred, and they stayed in a small apartment in the city of Oberwiesenborn. Very quickly, Kelli became pregnant, and while she was staying there in Germany, she had an encounter with a truly strange humanoid. As Kelli says in her own words, "I awoke one night in terror. There was a short little man, not more than 3 feet tall, standing close to my face. I cannot recall his features, except that he seemed to be leering as he reached out towards my pregnant belly. It looked like a troll. I could tell it wasn't young. It had an old feeling to it. It was leaning towards me. It seemed to have some kind of a hat. There was something unusual about his hands or his fingers. I jerked away from the side of the bed as he leaned in, and then noticed a long line of similar creatures standing all the way from this one to the door. There would have been 15 of them, or more. I was scared out of my mind. I got up on my knees and started pounding on Jay to wake up. By the time he opened his eyes and was listening to my crazy ranting, they had already vanished. To make matters worse, Jay didn't try to reassure me in any way or explain that I'd been dreaming, and instead he jumped out of bed, grabbed his medicine bags off the wall, and I remained there in the center of the big bed, cowering in fear as he went into the other room, I suppose to perform some ritual. So strangely, Kelli and Jay never discussed this. She did mention it to a few friends, but they awkwardly offered their explanation that she must have had a nightmare, which she knew wasn't true. Whatever this was that came into her room, she feels it was very interested in the fact that she was pregnant, interested in her baby. She doesn't understand it though because it didn't touch her at all. It was just standing there. And when she told Jay about the beings, he didn't seem at all surprised. In fact, he acted like he already knew what they were. And only after returning to the US and telling Jay's family about it, did she learn that they had their own theories about what these beings were. As Kelli says, Jay's family explained that these guys had been around forever, terrorizing women who are pregnant with Indian children. Uncle certainly knew about them, and Jay's father told me his brother had been harassed by them when they were children. Over the years, I've heard numerous accounts from many people about these little people, which they called weeapoos. So, Kelli's pregnancy went well. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy, and the little people did not reappear, at least not for a long time, and she assumed that her experiences with them were over. She did have precognitive dreams while she was in Germany. She woke to see her grandmother standing at the foot of the bed, radiant and happy, and she said, "I'm going to be with Dad." So she knew that her grandmother had passed away, which of course turned out to be true, and it really helped her grieving process. And then she had another dream where she saw Uncle, Jay's uncle. He looked very concerned and distressed, and the next day she found out that her uncle had in fact been murdered. So Kelli and Jay moved back to Southern California, grew their little family, had a new daughter. Years later, when her eldest son was 11 years old, these little people that she had seen returned. As Kelli says, "One early morning he came into my room scared to death by what he'd seen. As he related the story, the hairs on the back of my neck rose with comprehension. He said he woke up because our cat, who was sleeping with him, was freaking out, and when he opened his eyes, he saw a crowd of little men standing around him, making strange hand movements over his stomach. He said, 'I remember floating down the hallway.' I tried to act like it wasn't anything to worry about and probably a dream so I wouldn't scare him. Then I said he should try drawing a picture of them to take away the fear. And when he showed me the picture, I was overcome with disbelief and confusion. They looked just like the little men with pointed hats. How on earth could this be a coincidence? I never told him of my previous experience until he was grown up. He doesn't like it when I talk about it even now." So many times Kelli did ask her son for more details. He always refused. He says they're aliens and it's a subject he does not want to discuss. As Kelli says, he has always been really, really against anything that has to do with anything that implies UFOs or aliens. If anybody even talks about anything or he sees a book, he just immediately changes the subject. I have a couple of times just said, "What do you think?" And he says, "You know what? I just don't want to talk about that. It just gives me the creeps and I don't want to." So I haven't been able to get him to talk about these things because he's just horrified of the idea. How interesting is that? I mean, the way the Native Americans viewed her experiences are a little bit different perhaps than the way the average Western person does, but certainly fascinating. Also because Kelli's son started having experiences that were pretty much identical to her. This is the pattern we see with so many people. Contact is, generally speaking, generational. And it certainly does seem to be true in Kelli's case. And her experiences continued because she went through a very difficult period in her life, and this is when she had an experience that she's really not sure how to interpret. Was it angelic? Was it spiritual? Was this a spirit guide? She's really not sure, but it involved this really intensely amazing experience with orbs. It was not long after this that Kelli's life started to become a little bit of a struggle. Her marriage with Jay didn't work out and she got a divorce and had to raise the kids on her own. And she was just having a hard time working and going to school. She tried to ease her stress by gathering herbs and doing healing things, but life was very difficult and she just wasn't happy. And one evening, she lay down on the floor and closed her eyes, and as if a switch had been flipped, an overwhelming surge of joy swept over her, and laughter began to bubble out of her. It was so unexpected and out of the blue. Given how depressed she was, it made zero sense. And as Kelli says, there was no excuse for me to be all of a sudden joyous. So I thought, my God, I must be losing it. I opened my eyes and I saw what looked like a bubble, a round ball of light, but about the size of if you blew a bubble. It came in through the wall and started floating through the room. I just lay there, and this emotion continued, where I felt these waves of intense joy. I don't know why. I sat there and watched it, and pretty soon it started making all these strange movements. The feeling I had was that it was like dancing. It was moving around like it was aware that I was aware, like we were almost interacting in some strange way. As I continued to watch it and the emotion was getting stronger, it was so strong that it was almost devastating. It was like being in love only a zillion times. Just overwhelming emotion. I just lay there looking at this light and having these feelings. And then pretty soon, more of them came into the room and they started doing these almost like a choreographer designed dance. It went on for a long time. I had the feeling that I couldn't stand it anymore. It was just too intense, and I closed my eyes. And when I opened them, I saw them just going out through the wall and just disappearing and going away. So this left Kelli quite confused. What were these? Angels? Spirits? UFOs? She really had no idea. But whatever they were, the whole experience was very healing, and her depression completely lifted. As she says, I can't say what that was, but the emotion was just something else. I've never felt or seen anything like that before, and I hope someday I do again. How amazing and profound is that? It's an experience that Kelli looks back on with extreme fondness, and I don't blame her. Truly amazing. Angels, spirits, I don't know, but certainly a very, very positive experience. But as happens with contactees, the experiences are pretty much unending. The paranormal becomes normal when someone is a contactee. And with Kelli Anderson, I mean, her experiences are off the charts by strangeness. Owls are known to be a part of the ET contact experience. She's dealt with them throughout her life. Again, it was a big part of the whole paranormal with her life on the reservation. But now she was about to have an owl experience of such high strangeness that it is mind-boggling. And I'm glad she wasn't the only witness, or I don't think people would believe her. I mean, this one is just so weird. So time moved on, and one day Kelli wrote an article about hers and her other people's experience with what they called the weeapoos. And to her amazement, people responded to her article implying that these little men were actually extraterrestrials. She hadn't really considered this idea, not seriously, so she began to research the subject and was amazed to hear how closely her experiences and others matched with what people called ETs. She also learned that many people reported seeing owls in connection with ETs, and she became even more astonished because she and her family had just had this really crazy sighting with an owl. Many of them actually, but one was just off the charts weird. As Kelli says, I really got spooked because when my son had his experience, we were constantly having unusual owl sightings. Besides seeing them in the driveway and on fence posts in great numbers by daylight, we had a highly unusual incident while driving home one night. We were coming back from a birthday party at my aunt and uncle's house. The back road was very dark, and no other cars were around. Suddenly, I came around a turn and had to stop abruptly because a gigantic owl, the size of a small person, was standing in the middle of the road. It was just an impossibly, ridiculously large owl. We sat there for a long time. The kids leaned up over the back seat in amazement and were like, "Oh my God, Mom, Mom!" And we just stared at it, and it stared right back, straight at us. It was tripping me out because it was staring into my eyes. The kids were excited and scared at the same time. And my son said we needed to go see his grandpa. His grandfather, being of the owl clan, would surely know what it meant. I didn't take my eyes off the owl, but after a while it became so uncomfortable about its refusal to move that I let my truck roll closer to it, hoping to scare it off the road. It didn't budge, but just continued to stare, seemingly into my eyes. After what felt like a very long amount of time, the owl slowly turned and flew off. When I later told the kid's grandfather about it, he didn't know what to say, but it clearly disturbed him. Very hard to say what's going on there. I mean, you have a 4 or 5 foot tall owl, probably not an owl. And in fact, I mean, it was not only looked strange, but there it was, standing in the middle of the road, blocking the way, staring right at them. This could very well have been a screen memory. Hard to say for sure, but definitely unusual. And now, Kelli was going to get some answers about these strange visitations she had with these little people, because she finally decided to bring it up to the folks on the reservation. And she got a really interesting response about how they viewed these visitations that she was having. So it was some years later, Kelli was driving home with Jay and his friends, and she decided to bring up the subject of the UFOs, and again shared her own encounter with them, and asked them, so, are they real or what? And Jay said, they're real if you notice them, and his friend nodded in agreement. And Kelli shook her head and said, what kind of answer is that? Jay replied, they are there, but not everyone sees them. They like to prey on little kids and people who don't have a strong identity. And Jay's friend nodded and said, yeah. So Kelli turned to Jay's friend and said, have you seen them? And he said, yes. I've seen the little bastards, but I chased them away. You can't be afraid of them or they will never leave you alone. And she said, for some reason, I can't remember what they looked like. And this is when both Jay and his friend explained that these weeapoos, these little people, were nearly featureless. These guys made it clear that they didn't want to talk about it anymore, but Kelli dropped the subject. But she couldn't help but speculate about these little people. What were they? Beings from another dimension? ETs? Were they like fairies or elves or the so-called mythical people that seem to be present in various cultures throughout the world? She didn't know, but having experienced them herself and heard about other people's encounters, she knows only one thing, that they are real. And as she says, I feel more certain every day that something real is happening to us that defies ordinary explanations. If and how the psychic experiences are connected, I do not presently understand. She did take the step to ask her mother about UFOs, and to her shock, her mother revealed that she once did experience a missing time incident, but she didn't want to talk about it. So she asked her dad, and he also admitted that he had once seen a UFO. And as Kelli says, my dad totally doesn't believe in anything. He's one of these total imperial realists. He has even told me that when he was a teenager, he saw something that he could never explain. He said it was a round glowing object that seemed like it was under intelligent control that was in the distance. It sounded like a UFO to me, but he wouldn't use those words. He just shook his head and said, that was the darndest thing. I don't know what it was. But other weird memories that were possibly UFO related began to surface, because twice, several years apart, Kelli woke up at around 4 a.m. to a very unusual sight. As she says, both times I woke up in the middle of the night and the entire house was lit in a red light inside, evenly through the house, not like coming through a window or anything. Red light on everything, everywhere. And both times that it happened, they were within a couple of years apart, so I wasn't expecting it to happen again. But it was so similar that I immediately thought there was a fire. It was that bright. And when I started walking around the house, I realized it was not coming from anywhere. So my next thought was I must be getting some kind of horrid eye disease and going blind. And of course, that didn't happen, and I just sort of filed it away. How interesting is that? I mean, with so many Native American cultures, seeing all different kinds of little people, we might have to keep our minds open to how we interpret these events, because they're still are all kinds of questions surrounding contact. I suspect there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's not just ETs, but all different kinds of things. I do think Kelli is having contact with extraterrestrials in the classic sense, given that she did see UFOs, did have missing time. She was pregnant at the time of her encounter. I find that interesting because that is a pattern I've seen with many other people. But you can make up your own minds about it. And now we move to another really amazing experience in which Kelli got some answers about a very mysterious event in her childhood involving this tree spirit by the name of Birch. It was around 2005. Kelli went to bed one evening, and as she sometimes did, she began to reminisce about her childhood experiences with this tree spirit called Birch, the mysterious dream friend who had had such a huge and lasting impact on her life. She constantly wondered, who was he? Where had he come from? Why had he left? So pondering these questions, on impulse, she reached out to him telepathically, mentally, as she had often done before, but this time she asked out loud, "Who are you, Birch, really?" And the last thing she expected was what happened next. She heard a telepathic voice in her mind, and it was Birch, and he said, "I am here." She asked, "Are you a tree?" And he said, "I was able to share the energy of the trees to meet you." She asked, "Are you an angel or what?" He replied, "You may call me a messenger." "What's the message?" she asked. "Love," Birch replied. "What about it?" Birch said, "You can have it. You can give it." She asked, "Is it your mission to tell people this?" Birch said, "Yes." And she asked, "Like you did with me?" And Birch replied, "Always different." So she asked him, "How do you decide what to look like?" And Birch replied, "Like what you already love." So she asked him, "Why did you come to me?" And he said, "You were searching for a message, so I brought it." And then she asked him, "What is your message for me now?" And he said, "Heal. That's why my name to you is Birch." And she asked, "Have you been with me since?" And she's thinking since these dreams stopped, she had not sensed his presence. And he said, "Yes." And she said, "How?" He replied, "Music and poetry." At this point, Kelli asked, "Am I supposed to heal others?" And Birch replied, "Yes." "How?" she asked. And he replied, "By going up." Kelli wasn't quite sure what that meant and asked him, "You mean leaving my body?" And he said, "Yes." So she asked, "How?" And he said, "The answers are there." So she asked him, "Were you the voice?" Because she once recalled hearing a voice while she was out of body. And he said, "Yes, without form." And she asked, "Did I want to come here to be born on Earth?" And he said, "Yes." And she asked, "Did I have a plan?" And he said, "Yes, I am your reminder." And with that, he was gone, never to return again. Again, this entire conversation was telepathic, and it transpired very quickly. And immediately afterwards, Kelli did her best to write it all down as accurately as possible. But this conversation answered many of the questions she had about this strange and mysterious entity from her childhood. And she became really interested in the fact that his name was Birch, because she learned that the birch tree had numerous medicinal healing properties. It's a powerful anti-inflammatory to treat such conditions as arthritis, rheumatism, digestive troubles, urinary tract infections, insomnia, detoxifying, and more. And in fact, indigenous cultures have used birch for many purposes for centuries. There's a very strong mythology in many cultures about the tree. So she realized that that name was very significant. How amazing is that? Kelli looks upon that particular experience as a highlight in her life because it provided some answers as to what was going on during her childhood experiences with this apparent tree spirit. So interesting and really unique. Just amazing. And as Kelli's life continued, as is true with pretty much all contactees, the high strangeness continued. Through this day, Kelli continues to have many unexplained and very deeply spiritual experiences and UFO experiences. For example, in 2008, she invited a friend over to spend the night. And in the morning, her friend said, "Wow, something really weird happened last night." And Kelli said, "Like what?" And her friend said that she woke up to find the interior of the house entirely illuminated by an eerie green light. She actually got out of bed and wandered through the house looking for the source, but the light was everywhere. She couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, and after about 10 minutes she gave up looking for it and climbed back into bed. Now her friend thought it might have been a spiritual experience. Kelli didn't offer any explanation because she didn't really have one. So they just kind of sat there, stared at each other, and finally said, "Whatever." So that sounds like another UFO visitation to me. Hard to say for sure, but it certainly looks like it. There's been quite a few of them. I suspect that Kelli has been on board craft. It's unfortunate she has no memory of this, but that is not that unusual. But either way, what an amazing story of contact she has. So much to it, so many different types of visitations, so many different kinds of experiences. And I would say actually that's more the rule than the exception. Said it before, ET contact is not an isolated event and often comes along with a wide variety of paranormal events. And as you can see, that's 100% true with Kelli Anderson. I really have to thank her for sharing her experiences with me. I know it's not easy for a lot of people. She did, again, insist upon anonymity. And as you can see, her experiences are strange enough where I totally understand why she didn't want people to know her real name. Again, I did write about her experiences in much more detail in my book, Humanoids and High Strangeness. It's one of 20 accounts where people have had direct contact with humanoids of one kind or another. But I have to say, Kelli's story is one of my favorite in the book, just because it's so unusual, so unique, and so varied. So I really want to thank you guys for watching. I truly appreciate it. It's because of you I do this research. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next time, keep searching for the truth. Keep asking those hard questions. And most important of all, because I really think that's why we came to Earth, keep having fun. I will see you next time. Bye for now.